All right, so today live review of the Rabbit Hole Cavehill Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey. This is a product of the Rabbit Hole Distillery, 47.5% ABV, 95 proof. It is non-chill filtered and is at least 3 years in new charred oak. The mash bill is 70% corn, 10% wheat, 10% malted barley, 10% honey malted barley. So there's lots of grains in here. It is a four grain triple malt mash bill. There's no rye in this at all. And again, despite the fact that this is a straight bourbon whiskey, there is a sneaky 3-year age statement on the back here. You can't probably barely see, but it says matured over 3 years in new charred American oak barrels. So to be clear, in order to write the word straight on the bottle, either it has to be older than 4 years old, or they have to put an age statement on the bottle if it's younger than 4 years old. And it looks like there's no age statement, but it does say 3 years on the back here, in a very kind of sneaky manner. So despite the fact that this says straight, it is not at least 4 years old, but it still follows the rules. Um, and as far as I know, this Rabbit Hole Distillery, despite being fairly new, I think it's still independently owned by this Kavazanmanian fellow. I haven't heard if that's changed, if it's been bought by somebody. They also have a couple different common varieties of this. There's a high rye version. There's one that's finished in Pedro Menez. And I think there's also a rye whiskey, if that's right. But this is kind of just their four grain, kind of Buck Standard one. Nothing else really going on here. So we're going to rate this out of 100. 25 for the aroma, 25 for the palate, 25 for the finish, 10 for texture, and 15 for my subjective personal experience. Again, so this is technically 3-year-old Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey, not chill filtered. And of course, since we're talking about straight bourbon whiskey, this is an uncolored beverage here. So this is natural color. So it is maybe a little bit pale for bourbon, but still has some good coloration. Those new charred oak barrels are doing their thing here. Now, the one thing about the stuff out of Rabbit Hole is they're kind of going for some innovative approach here. And with this mash bill, and I guess with some of the choices that they made in the production of this particular whiskey, they're trying to push some of the notes out of like those typical bourbon notes. So a lot of the like notes that come out of the distillery say things like apple. What else is there? Creamy orange and honey and stuff like that. Almost notes that are very Scotch-like. And this is still drinks like a bourbon to me. In my previous drams of it. But that being said, it's almost like a bourbon with a lot of the sweetnesses extracted out. It's not nearly as sweet as similar bourbons, I feel. And it has a lot of other kind of drier notes going on. That being said, it's still a bourbon at the end of the day. It's got the corn, it's got the new charred oak barrel, so it's hard to escape that full kind of like bourbon character, but we'll see kind of how we feel about it today. Um, Immediately, I kind of get like a spiced apple kind of note. It is a little bit woody. Some oak in there. There's a little bit of that like corn-based buttery note today, which I don't always get off of this, but it's definitely showing some today. But overall, it's not that sweet. It's a little bit spicy and a little bit on some of those kind of like brighter fruits. Whiskey raccoon? Absolutely. Likeable sarcasm. How's it going? I think you were in here earlier. Uh, Thanks for coming back. Unfortunately, on TikTok, I can't change the like broadcast category without restarting the stream, and I just didn't want to do that because sometimes when I like go live on TikTok, my broadcast will like not take right, and it'll just be like a black screen. So I just like if it's going, we're gonna keep it going. Um, you're doing solid, thanks. Yeah, I kind of like broke even today, which is not bad. But obviously the goal is to go up. It'd be nice to hit Grandmaster before the 21st, but we'll see what happens. All right. So again, Rabbit Hole Cavehill Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey on the palate. Cheers. Again, kind of like what I was saying before about this particular bottle. It's kind of ringing true to me right now. Um, it's very bourbon-esque, and of course it is a Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey, so it's going to taste like bourbon to some degree, but it's not very sweet. It's kind of like a lot of the like, we'll say brown sugar or butterscotch or caramel or like syrupy kind of notes that sometimes you get in bourbon whiskey, kind of like really absent here. And that might have something to do with like the barrel choice, because like I know that some of the like heavily toasted barrels kind of seem to have more of a tendency to get those sweet characters extracted from them, and maybe they used barrels that weren't very toasted for this. I actually don't know anything about the new charred oak barrel for this particular whiskey. I don't know if it's like, maybe it's like, again, number 4 char but a low toast or something like that, so it's not as sweet. That being said, it's also not all the whiskeys in here are terribly old, so it might have something to do with just them being a little bit young in the barrel. But I think ultimately this is kind of a flavor profile that they're going for. They're kind of going for kind of like some new and interesting kind of flavors and less of like the typical bourbon flavors. I don't really get the citrus orange thing that they talk about. The palate to me is kind of like a lot of the same flavors you get at a bourbon. Like you get the oaky woodiness, you get some spicy character, you do get a little bit of like fruitiness to it, but it's like a lot of the sweetness is stripped out of this particular whiskey. It's kind of what it feels like. So if you're looking to bourbon for like the sweet notes, this is kind of like the exact opposite of the kind of bourbon I think you would probably want to go for. Um, there is a bit of like a honey on the aroma, but it's not like the deep kind of darker sugars that you might expect at a bourbon. There is kind of an apple note, but to me it's kind of like an apple skin. Um, or kind of a very like a very dry apple, but I think apple skin is a good descriptor. Like spiced apple skins more than like spiced apple with some honey. There's some oakiness in there. I don't hate the nose, but the palate is kind of like just reminding us that this is bourbon for the most part. Palate does present maybe like a little bit of sweetness now, but and I'm not really getting the citrus thing that they talk about with this whiskey. It still is kind of like a little bit of that honey sweetness. You get a little bit of oak, and then some of that spiciness in the back palate. And then the finish is like, again, some of that oakiness, some of that spiciness. You get a little bit of like maybe a corn essence here, like a corn echo. Maybe like an echo of that like apple skin. Finish length is like medium minus. We'll call it like medium minus. It's not bad. But for me, the flavors are just like, okay, you know? So we'll take one more sip and then we'll start thinking about numbers. We're just going to try to give it some time to have some kind of development. Some of these whiskeys, you know, they get some extra development after a little while in the glass, but we're not going to hold it so long that it's kind of egregious. The way I kind of like want to like look at things is kind of like, well, if you're going to have a whiskey and you pour it neat and you kind of let it sit for 10 minutes and then you kind of slowly drink it, what kind of experience can you expect? Some of these whiskeys, they do have some kind of dimension change if you leave them out for like half an hour or an hour. But it's kind of like, hey, I'm not going to like pour a whiskey and drink it in like an hour. You know what I mean? So we're not going to worry too much about the notes that come out of this in an hour's time. Just the notes that we can kind of get within a reasonable amount of time. If this thing becomes a cracker an hour after it's in the glass, so be it, I guess. Yeah, it's about the same. Honey and oak, spices, apple skin. The intensity of aromas is pretty good, and the intensity of flavors is pretty reasonable too. We're not really like hunting for flavor. The flavor is being well presented. I do kind of like the honey bit on the nose, though. It's nice. The finish starts off really oaky. There's like a good oak spike right at the start of the finish. You get some spiciness as it lingers. Kind of that apple skin gets a bit of a resurgence. And there's like some bitter oak and like apple skin into like the end of the finish. Okay, so at a 25, let's talk about the aroma. And for those of you who are new hanging out, all of these all of my reviews, notes, scores, and we'll say rankings are in my Discord server. So if you're, regardless of what platform you're on, in the profile of my channel, whichever platform you're on, there should be a Discord link to my server, which has all of my reviews done. I think this is review number 39. No, I think it's 38 or 39 anyway. So there are a bunch of other spirits on there that we've already talked about. And of course, all of these segments are also posted to YouTube for your on-demand pleasure. All right, so there's several notes, but they vary a bit in intensity. We get them pretty easily, but there's not that much going on. You get an oakiness, you get a honey sweetness, you get the apple skin, some spices. That's about it. The honey is like the predominant note. And then the others are kind of accent players. So at 25, we're going to call this like 14, I think. It's good. So on the palate, focus on the palate at 25. Right on the attack, you get some oakiness. The honey sweetness kind of picks in. You get some of that, like, a little bit of fruity character. Then you kind of have a growing spice into the back palate. Not really wanting for flavors. Presents pretty well. There's no donut. There's no drop. They're a pretty reasonable intensity. Call palette 17. I like 17 out of 25. Then we're going to talk about the finish. So the finish is like slightly short, but still pretty reasonable. Medium in length for me. Again, it's mostly kind of like an oak spike right at the start of the finish. And then you get a little bit of that kind of like spice and apple in there. We'll see if we get some kind of sweetness out of it here. Feel on this in the like 13 to 16 range. You have some oakiness right at the start of the finish. Little like whisper amount of sweetness. Not really getting the apple skin this time, but there's some spice. Kind of that oak and that maybe a little bit of apple skin kind of presents at the end of the finish. Again, about medium minus in length. I'll call this one 15. Not bad, not bad. So at 10, let's talk about the texture. Is it thin? Is it watery? Is it thick? Is it viscous? We like it to be thick and viscous, if at all possible. This one is coming across a bit middle of the road. It's not terribly like thin, but it's not doing anything crazy. So we're just gonna try to focus on the texture here. It's a little bit lower. It's a little bit on the thinner side. Really, I'd call this 3, which is like not quite smooth. 3 to 10. It's a little bit more watery than I thought when I really thought about it. It could do better. All right, so out of 15, my personal subjective experience with this whiskey. And I think the thing about this whiskey that is the most interesting is that they did comply with the rules for bourbon. And they've made something that is a little different. It is a little different than your typical bourbon. It's not as sweet. It has a little bit of a weird kind of like apple skin fruit character to it. So they try to do something different. But it's not like wildly different than bourbon. It's like pretty close to bourbon, with some of the sweetnesses turned down, some of the other kind of interesting characteristics turned up a little bit to try to make it seem like it's doing something new and inventive within the confines of the new charred oak barrel. It's not bad. It's doing something distinct, but it's not blowing me away. Nothing about this bottle is like, hey, I gotta have it. It's so tasty. It's doing this interesting thing. No wild flavors. The flavor profile isn't hooking me. That being said, it's not bad. It's just not. It's not it. So we'll call this 7 out of 15 distinct rating. So it's fairly distinct, but it's not wowing me in any way. So like that. We'll get our nifty calculator. So if we have 14 and 17 and 15 and 3 and 10. It's 59. We call this 59 out of 100. And that is a good whiskey. It's good. You know, it's good. Nothing amazing, but it's good. Not bad.